Hey folks, Steve here with I guess I'll say follow-up second impressions video for the old GBACW system and my play of Cedar Mountain over the last month or so, or 2 months. I've been slowly playing Cedar Mountain with a friend of mine and another friend who's GMing it, so to speak, game mastering it for us and looking after us playing the rules right, instead of my usual World in Flames cadence. So it's nice to break up the rhythm. And I did a video a little while ago that I do suggest you watch first before watching this one. So this is the second impressions video via Cedar Mountain. I would recommend reading my first impressions because we're going to kind of talk about the rest of the battle as it went until we stopped and some follow-up thoughts over the system. So uh, So what you should be seeing here on screen is a map photo of the mid game and leaving off from the last one. Now, if you wanted to go see the immediate preceding situation, go ahead and check out the previous video and look towards the end. I have a snapshot there of what the game was looking like, and this is where things sort of advanced to. You can see that the game situation is a bit different, and ultimately, if I kind of go into analysis mode here, we are looking at a couple of developments, right? One significant one is that my position, now you're looking at it from the Union angle of the map, so keep that in mind, but my left position, which I was aiming to hold a victory point location, has basically been lost. But I succeeded in doing what I wanted to there, which was use the least amount of force to hold a victory point hex, basically for as long as possible, and basically distract a very large body of men for as long as possible. And I did do that. So while the position is lost, I did lose some artillery that was captured. That really hurts from a victory point perspective. And ultimately, you can start to see that routing unit there is some cavalry. I've got one unit left that's kind of, trying to just harass the rebels as they're making their way down the trail to the main road path. But that was sort of all of that was sort of a known thing that was going to happen. Um, Now, more to the center of the map or the main body of action, there is a particular hill that is worth victory points that I had been trying to hold, but with that sort of red arrow indicator, the rebels had been, my friend was firing tons of artillery, tons of shots into that hex and around it. And I was eventually getting units routed out. Like I could not hold the position under so much fire. And he eventually did send some forces forward to take the hill. Now, I don't think, I don't know that that was necessarily the best option just because I have local number advantage there, though only just barely do I. So that was kind of a real touch and go thing. Like if my units would continue to get degraded over time in that area, like that could have proven to be a pretty major issue, just given like how much terrain there is there, that could eventually pose a problem. So that situation was developing, and then on the main sort of hill, I was finally getting all of my troops in order where I wanted them to be to do a general Union push. And in fact, you can see at the head of that blue arrow there, the first unit that's really pushing forward, perhaps dangerously so, to basically be a not quite a sacrifice, but to be the spear point that would allow the other units nearby to get into a better position, um, and sort of force the rebel attention on that guy. Now, Banks is still situated in a hex with forest and units that are kind of they're really the hinge point. That you can see that hex with Banks in it directly, the 1 star blue leader, being a focal point where the rebels have fired tons of artillery, tons of shots into that hex. And while I do occasionally lose a step, um, I I can't really lose morale checks basically, and so they're just holding. And I've rotated units into there to keep hold of that hex because to me it's a very important hex, and ultimately it served well as a distraction. It was just something that could not be ignored, always threatening the other victory point hex that's underneath some of the Confederate units there. Um, so that was always the threat, and it was my hinge upon I was planning on getting all of my troops that you can see there that are coming up on the hill, coming out of the forest, to smash into the rebel position. Right, that had been my plan throughout the game, was to try to get up there and get into some decent terrain and duke it out for the hill and just see what happens. That's the best I can hope for in a battle that historically the United States did not win. Now, um, we played on a few more turns from here, and let's show you show things where they wound up here. Um, and what you can see is uh, you know progression on the map, and probably not in ways that are unsurprising, but maybe what I was achieving up on the hill could be a surprise. So let's go into analysis mode once again, and let's talk about kind of what was going on. On the far left, that detachment, my Greens detached brigade, had become degraded itself. I mean, it was just total loss there, and you can see that the rebels are coming across the run, the river there, um, and are kind of threatening my you know my supply lines. Maybe you want to think of it as. There's also a rule in this game that if he had surged all those units off the map down to the lower right, following that road path, he could get victory points for units taken off map. And I'm not sure if he was really aiming to do that or not, but this is kind of the situation and where I planned to take the battle if we continued on. So we stopped playing basically on turn 10 with my opponent, the rebel player, saying, I'm I don't see how I can win, and he called it. We called it. But I do feel like I was winning, and it really comes down to a couple of things. If we were going to continue playing, you can see with my terrible artwork that I had reclaimed that central hill, and that the position of the rebels that were continuing to fire upon that hill were starting to be put at great risk due to my push on the hill. And so I was going to be willing to leave the victory point empty and pull these units back. And you can start to see just on the other side of the road, I was pulling some independent artillery back down the hill, um, to set up a new defensive line along that southern ridge. So the idea there would be, pull those units back, use the cornfield to get into position without too much, harassment, and basically just hold out for a couple of turns. That's all I would really need to do there, and hope not to suffer any major losses. My only hope and advantage would be that the rebel units that are coming across the river tend to have lower morale and tend to only be armed with muskets. So I could try to hope for a slight, a very poor, maybe weapons advantage by having rifles. My morale's not very good either, but the hope would be to just delay and keep them from being particularly useful, or at least, um, force them to take a different move. At this point in the game, I wasn't worried about the victory point locations. Ultimately, the fact that you can pick up, two per location per turn is nice, but I ended up finding out that the real source of my victory points were from other things, which I'll talk about in a second. But it was to the point where hey, I made a good fight of these victory points. I don't need to hold on to them for dear life. I can afford to give up that hill after I held it for another turn or two, and just pull back and just see what I can do to play for more time and do what damage I can do along the way. That would have been the idea. Now, on the hill is really where things turned intense, because while the rebel forces were getting continuous fresh troops that were coming down the road network, there's a bit of a traffic jam going on, and they couldn't quite put all that force to bear, at least the way that they were maneuvering. Um, and I had a couple of things that were going to go my way, I thought, and then it didn't go my way. So one, I did have my general push, and the idea was if I could hurt the rebels bad enough, I would force them to route or retreat through each other and sort of create a chain route. And I didn't quite get that, but by leveraging my cavalry, I was able to continually do a flank maneuver that punished the rebel troops quite severely. I was really setting up to have a really grand old time, except you can see there's a ton of routed units there of mine, and that came down to defensive fire from the rebels. And I just was like, you couldn't imagine it, guys. Like, it was just my opponent was rolling hot like crazy at the beginning of this session. This was like the third session, basically, in the final one for this picture. And he was rolling high, hitting me hard, and I was rolling sixes for morale checks, routing like crazy. So my big, Union push, while I think it did reasonably well, maybe at the start, really started to look tenuous, and really my position was only saved by the fact that I put my cavalry at great risk to flank the rebel position and kind of force them to respond. All it was going to take to fix those routed units was to send Gordon, who's currently up in the thick of things, send the leader back and start to rally those units, because those routed units, while they're routed, were still pretty good units. They still had a lot of strength left in them. So there's a pretty good body of men untouched on that hill that just need to be put back into the battle. By that point, I had set up a reasonably safe set of artillery firing lanes. One on the far right, where I have the note there. I also have one pointed towards um, sort of the direction. He's just north of the routed units, facing the rest of the hill. So if more Confederate troops try to push through that center spot there on the center of the hill, I would have some firing capability and try to force them back. And most critically, so despite having really bad die rolls for me for a good chunk of it, things kind of twisted back my direction in one particular set of combats where you can see just at this almost center right of the screen where I have a note about the rebel already about to be captured. I pushed with some decent strength forces that still had a lot of strength points. I pushed through in behind the Confederate line. I basically broke the Confederate line and was managing to start to capture a lot of their artillery that had been set up on that hill, either to attack me, in that area in general, also to attack that hill to the lower left. So those artillery, the rebel artillery was exposed. I captured a whole bunch. I was in the process of about to capture more, and in fact had routed the crew away. And so there's, I was going to capture more artillery, and then I was very likely in that blue circle that I'm noting going to capture even more artillery there, um, and another victory point location. And so it was going to be a little tricky because it wasn't a sure thing, but I had a very good setup there to where um, the leader and the forces that had been holding out in my hinge point could move forward and basically capture, the rest of the guns or hurt the infantry that's trying to stick with the guns. That would have been worth a whole lot of victory points, even by itself. And of course, I would then, continue to be either even or advantaged on the turn-to-turn victory point location situation. The real thing that I think mattered the most was that I tried very hard to hurt particular brigades where I could, and this led to it was early Telefiero, Telefiero. I can't speak, and I can't remember if it was Ronald or Garnett. Maybe it was Garnett. Uh, their brigades had become degraded in the system where, if they take a certain number of step losses, the whole brigade becomes degraded. They suffer a bunch of penalties, but you also earn a boatload of victory points for achieving that. And I had done that to all those guys, and really only my green detachment could have been considered to be degraded. I had managed to, for one reason or the other, keep my forces from being totally degraded, just in terms of where the strength point losses were. I think a few of my brigades were getting pretty close to being degraded. But the fact that I had done that, already to those three brigades was a really big deal, worth a lot of victory points. And I would think over the course of turn 10 and 11, say if I was going to try to think through like what happens over the course of those last four turns, like I think I would have won. And that's why I was like, you know what? Like if you want to stop, man, let's stop. Because I had a pretty good feeling for my game position. I had basically set up, or what I would be executing over the course of those next four turns was again a sort of fighting retreat down in the uh, what would be the lower part of the map from our perspective, kind of holding those guys off, the forces that were coming from uh, Slaughter Cedar Mountain itself, holding those guys off, complete the capture of the position with the blue circle, and then really just getting the rest of my units into my own defensive line there, where generally, I mean, the rebel forces could try to push on my position, but I was going to be in a pretty good spot, leveraging my leaders to have really good morale, and having good firing positions that, I mean, over the course of those next four turns, there could be a lot of bloody fighting, but it would probably be attritional. And if it was equally attritional, I would probably come out ahead, but more likely that I was going to come out ahead of the attritional situation anyway, and just walk away with a pretty convincing victory at the end of the day. So I feel it was like interesting, to kind of tie this all together. Like I think the battle went interestingly well for me. I think I made some good plays by saying, "Hey, I'm going to discount, make a run at some of these victory point locations." And I had a clear strategy from the start of flanking. That trail network ends up becoming really, really important, so that, I got my cavalry, I got some other units to take the long route, but the route with cover through the woods, up over some hills, through the trail where then I could speedily move along the trail system, and then get my units into that nice arc of trees at the top of that main hill near the wheat field, where that was my whole strategy, like get up there and flank, and every time I can try to do another flank maneuver, do it. And the flank maneuver helped because it was, I need to hit him in a place where it's going to cause havoc. And so long as I can cause havoc around his line, I can then push. And I was able to execute that. So it was good that I was in my head thinking, okay, I'm gonna need to try this, and it's a bit of a gamble. But what's the worst that can happen? I'm just gonna lose the battle like history. What else can I do? I might as well try to make something happen here, and it worked out. But the dice are fickle, and it could have gone a different way, certainly. Um, so it worked out. You have to think, like, what's the net result of this? Well, um, however indecisive it would ultimately be, I think with these brigades as defeated as they were, there'd be a situation where I think the rebels would have to maybe call off and kind of fall back a bit. And you imagine this certainly would affect the Battle of Second Bull Run, which is, this battle was preceding that. So maybe, the forces of the rebels too degraded to support, and who knows, I don't know if this would mean the Union would win, or the United States would win the Battle of Second Bull Run, but certainly this was a better showing than history by quite a bit. So there's that to look at. Now, when you look at the victory points from just strength points lost or captured, I think those were at the end of it, at least where we stopped, it became more even. Certainly, I think the rebels were fortunate in the early game where they had managed to capture some strength points and some artillery where it was maybe against me, but I think I ended up catching back up, and I mean, just on all the numbers, the United States would come out ahead in the calculus there. So I don't know that those four turns next would have made a huge difference for the rebel player. I mean, there's a lot of fresh units coming in, but it's hard to get them into the point of contact. He was still trying to pull back the degraded units, so he's kind of stuck playing traffic cop a little bit, and all I have to do is hold my new position in the woods, uh, up at the top of the screen, and then along the hill at the center with my firing lanes of artillery able to support the defense, and maybe even start to push some of my artillery back down to the lower part of the screen where I would set up that new defensive line. So I had a I have some confidence in how well I would execute through the rest of the scenario, because at that point I'm really just holding. I just have to hold a defensive posture, um, which is really the better position to be in the system, and I think that's something worth talking about here. When it comes to the system, and this is probably appropriate, being in the positional defensive is obviously much better. I mean, I don't think anyone should be surprised by that. I think even in the simpler version of this system, it gets that right for the American Civil War. The fact that, and this feels appropriate, like this battle, in fact, is a really great example of this, of trying to gain the terrain advantage. Like if you are, I mean, let's think of this, the holistic picture of this battle. At the beginning, right, the two forces are on separate ends of the map, and there's this sort of, the game asks you to advance to grab the victory point location. That's your incentive. Now, you could aim not to do that and maybe still come out the winner, but one side that gets all the victory point hexes and can just hold them is going to probably win, right? You've achieved the positional need, which is to grab the victory point hexes, and you're accruing victory points. And the only way that your opponent can make them up is to either deprive you of those victory point hexes by attacking you, or doing sufficient losses and damage to you that somehow they make up the victory point difference. So the early part of this battle is about grabbing the victory point hexes that you can, and I think my early run to grab some of those victory point hexes, I mean that really was um, a key thing for me. The fact that I grabbed the one in the forests right around my routed units in this picture, that I ran as hard as I could to go grab those, because I could at least fight around them. So long as I'm there and I'm fighting around the victory point hex, great. I could not help but lose or have the rebels take the one that's along the main road, because the rebels could simply run up the road. I wasn't going to beat them in time. There's just no way for me to get there, where my fast moving cavalry could just run really fast and get where I needed to go. So that shaped the battle, right? That my right flank was anchored in a victory point location, and the terrain of the hill, right, coming up the hill on that right side from my perspective, is protected. Unless the rebels were right up on top of those crests firing down, I could use the hill to kind of protect myself, and I could move into the forest. I could ascend without direct fire, and then be coming out of those forests at the same terrain level to engage the rebels. And that ended up working really, really well. And my focus of force, or where I said I'm just going to go really thin in a couple of these areas and have strength in the other, ended up having some great advantage, right? And if I'm fighting from good terrain and I'm getting all these good shifts to the left on the defense, um, that ends up being huge. And so what ended up occurring was, like, I crossed the T of the rebel position, right? You think about this like that might be more of a naval term. We talk about like the Battle of Jutland or something, but that's what I did. I mean, that hill is kind of you know uh, rectangular shaped basically, and I moved my Union forces to be the T through that forest at the top of the T, right? If the top of the T was on the right hand side and the lower part of that T was heading up and to the left. Probably should have made a picture for this, what I'm saying, but oh well. You get it, right? And so I could simply exist there, and um, I was temporarily gaining victory point advantages because my early seizure of the far left one, the center Lone Hill one, and the far right one, and even if the rebels had taken that center one, that's great. They are now having to fight for their position in the center. And that's a fight that I'm happy to have because they're stuck in the open. And that sort of terrain differential ended up paying off over the course of the game really, really well. So the way that the system, at least the old 1.0 perspective here, is that ultimately it works out to use maneuver. Like this is not World War One yet, right? And even if the late stages of the American Civil War became more World War One like, maneuver is so important, and it's the can I force my opponent to be doing something he doesn't want to do, which is attack? How can I shape the map or the battlefield positions that I am in control of the terrain that I want, and that terrain is reasonably good, and my opponent has to attack me to shift the game momentum. And so long as I can say I'm in a spot that I like and I can defend in it, I'm going to have a tremendous advantage. Um, those shifts to the left can really make it so that at worst, your defending units can only be pinned or maybe routed. And if you've got pretty good morale, or at least you've got the right guys in place, it can be really hard to dislodge somebody. Like my hinge point, where I could take losses. I can't negate the losses, but I can negate a pin. I can negate a route, or I can turn a route into a pin result, which is fine. I just need my guys to stay there while the rest of my hammer, bangs the anvil, so to speak. So maneuver, super important. Understanding how to move units in the system, very important. Like, where do you want to be? Where do you think you can get to? There's no uncertainty in your ability to move. So an infantry unit's always going to get its 6 movement points. So what are you going to do with those 6 movement points? How far can you get unaccosted? And at what point do you have to, stop moving? So you can kind of plan out where you think you might be, looking at the map as you go. Of course, each session we played, I had to refresh my mind on like, what am I doing? Where are my guys? What's the terrain like again? What am I supposed to be doing? Um, but that ended up being so big, right? Get into the position that you need to be in. If you've got your leaders, I mean, yeah, your leaders could be hurt, shot, lost, wounded, but they provide such a great advantage to help with morale checks that I was very bold with them. I didn't mind using them. Stick them in the front, baby. Got to be bold here, and that proved valuable in many spots of the map because I need my guys to stay in place. So long as I'm in position and I'm in a location that I like, I need to hold that position. And if I can do that, defensive fire is great. And much to my chagrin, I suffered that quite a bit because so many of Gordon's troops had routed. Unfortunately, that was it was horrifying, guys, to be rolling six after six after six, multiple sixes in a row in a bad way. Like that's depressing, and then not getting that six when you're on the attack is so frustrating. So it was I was in a deep valley of despair for a little bit there because of the uncertainty of my forces and the fact that I'm rolling just the worst die roll you can imagine and getting guys routed. Like that sucks. You lose position when you route. So that was unfortunate, but I had enough other units kind of guarding their flank that an individual route is sustainable, or at least, if one unit routes and the other one stays, it's not a complete disaster. And that again, that defensive fire just totally throws off your opponent's offensive. Right? They march up. They have to survive or not be pushed back by defensive fire, whether that's artillery or musketry, rifles, whatever, small arms fire, I guess I should say. You have to kind of play the odds and go like, hey, I'm going to push, and I have to survive this threshold. I need to get past all this defensive fire. I'm charging enemy positions and I'm under fire. And it can go south, right? It's going to send you backwards. And when your opponent gets pushed back like that, like I'm lucky that Gordon's men here were not under much direct threat of being hit with artillery. There's a little bit there you can see that was feasible. That would have been pretty bad to happen, but they were too busy those units were going to be too busy firing at close range at the units right in front of them. I'm talking about the artillery just to the right of the blue circle. Those guys could have been firing at those routed units and maybe hurting them, tearing them up, but they were too busy having to deal with the units right in front of them, who are simply going to melee them and capture the guns. And that's really another aspect of the system that is interesting to think through and understand the power of. Um, so defensive fire is all one concern, right? If you've got good defensive fire, if your units are in place and you've got a lot of ability, a lot of strength points to chuck into firing, yeah, you can send an entire maneuver reeling backwards by forcing retreats or losses before they get a chance to do their offensive fire, and they have to hope that their offensive fire does something to you, right? That's a very hard thing. Super defender advantage in that way. Um, but at the tail end of that, right, if you survive the defensive fire, you get your own offensive fire, and then if you're really fortunate, you wind up in the situation where, and this is where you choose to shoot with offensive capability really matters in this system, at least 1.0, of melee, choosing to melee, and that decision is tricky as hell because it doesn't take much it doesn't take much melee advantage to be worthwhile doing it. It's not an odds calculation, it's a differential calculation. So even a six strength unit meleeing a four strength unit has a lot of advantages, and so on. And if you've got multiple units involved, you can certainly rack up a like +6 differential. That might be great. You might be in a really great position to defeat the enemy, and you can capture units with melee, and that's going to be worth more victory points. Early on in the battle, I undervalued melee, and the rebels managed to really hurt me with melee. That I didn't. This was a learning game. I was like, oh man, like that sucked. I just got meleeed all to hell. I need to think through how do I work it for me, and you can certainly make it work for you. I mean, that's how I broke the Confederate line and started capturing their artillery by just forcing some melee where I knew I'd have advantages. The only con is if you're doing melee with, say, multiple units, maybe from multiple hexes into one hex, and you advance with those guys, like you could end up with some overstacking and a really juicy target for a sort of revenge shot from artillery, especially for artillery that are three hexes away and they can get basically a shot on each unit individually. So there's a really tough decision around when you're going to surge forward and do melee that could be highly beneficial, but you could get punished for it if you're not careful. And I think by the end of the scenario that we were playing, like I finally clicked on how I want to use melee and just, knowing the certainty of the results that like, hey, as soon as you're on this column, like you're likely not going to have any bad thing happen to you. And if you can sustain where you end up after the melee advance, like you should do it. You should do it plenty. Early in the battle, I wasn't doing it as much, but there's a possibility I should have done it more. The only con of that have been maybe it would mean my guys leaving the forest and entering into that clear terrain. So it all kind of shook out well. But I think in the way that the system comes together, even just this 1.0 old days version, it feels appropriate, I think, to the era. It's like you can have more men, but if the point of contact is narrow, it comes down to who's at the front line. It's good to have reserves, of course, but you could also trigger a mass retreat if the guys are running into each other and they're getting flighty. That defensive fire is so very important, morale so very important. Even having rifles over muskets so important because you can engage your full strength further away, which means that muskets trying to advance on rifles are certainly going to be even in an even worse position than if they were having the same armament. So the United States advantage in having more rifles generally in their army in this battle, I think helps a lot. So I don't know that I think you could look at this game state and say, well, maybe two experienced players, the United States would not have a good time. Like maybe only because we were both new players and I really committed to a strategy that and the dice went enough my way that I achieved the victory here. I think that there's plenty of things that the rebel side could have done, maybe in response to my strategy, that might have, changed things, made it harder for me to operate. Um, but as you're learning the system, it's hard to know like what to do. I don't think, yet I wouldn't recommend what I did as like the end all be all strategy if you're going to play this battle in the 1.0 version. Like, could you achieve the same thing? What are the types of things that the rebel player could have done differently to defeat my strategy? Certainly, there's plenty of bandwidth there to pursue. I do think that the rebels are generally advantaged in this battle, just in terms of numbers, and that they can change the point of contact, with their own flanking maneuvers potentially. It just, trying to figure it all out. I am curious how different this battle feels and plays in the Twin Peaks more modern rendition of this battle in the modern GBACW. Unfortunately, copies of Twin Peaks go for sale for like $200, so I don't expect I'm going to play that anytime soon, or even get a copy of it anytime soon. So this will have to suffice. But overall, guys, I think this Cedar Mountain battle was really fun. The system was fun, and I appreciate that it is not a very, very complex system. I mean, it has its intricacies. We were advantaged by not having to worry about ammo, which we will need to worry about when we play the next battle that we're going to play, which Pleasanton. Maybe I'm getting it wrong, the name wrong. We'll be playing another battle in a couple months, so it might be a little while before I do more reporting on GBACW 1.0 stuff, but there will be more, and we'll talk more about it then, I guess, when it comes up. So thanks for watching this one, guys. Hope this was at least interesting. Again, it's hard to say, how to really compare this to modern GBACW, other than it's simpler. And my distinct hope that when these simple GBACW rules are released sometime, I know they're coming. I do hope that it is very similar to 1.0, because that would make for a really easy transition, and I could get to playing some of the games in my collection much more swiftly than otherwise, as the tide goes. So thanks for watching, guys. We'll call it here. See you in the next one. Take care. Keep gaming.